Nettie Wiebe. I'm a farmer in the west of Canada and a member of the CSM, the civil society mechanism representing small-scale farmers.
Thank you. My name is Ruchi Tripathi. I work with the CSM, facilitating the women's group, women's constituency, and been associated with the CSM for a very long time. In my day job, I work with ActionAid International.
We've organized this 2-hour webinar as the CSM, the Civil Society Mechanism for Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, because we are all in the midst of a phenomenon which we have not before experienced, which is a global pandemic, which is, first of all, in the first order, a health event, but of course, very quickly becoming, in many parts of the world, a food crisis. And the Committee on World Food Security is that platform that pulls together the international governance and actors, both private sector and civil societies, a very broad range of those who are not only have a great impact on food systems, but in this format are also decision makers, policy makers, where policy convergence around food systems is formulated. It was formed, the CFS was formed, as we know, much earlier, but reformed radically in view of the 2007-2008 food crisis. And we find ourselves now again in a place where we're dealing with a food crisis pending, as I said, in some places already on full-on crisis in many parts of the world. So we've pulled together this webinar to share information. We recognize that there's a vast amount of divergent opinions and a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise that we need to share in this moment of crisis. And we have pulled together a very deep panel on this. But we want to hear from a wide range of participants, of course. We want this to serve as a platform where we have divergent opinions, we have expertise, we have the recognition that this will take knowledge from many sectors, not just one kind of expertise, but a vast amount of expertise that is shared and that we think together and work together on this immense and enormous challenge that we face. So that's what we want to do in the next few hours. We want to begin that discourse with the hope, of course, that this is a model and not an endpoint of what we need to do in this moment. I want to introduce, first of all, the first speaker, who is joining us. Yes, there you are. Maximo Torero, who is the Assistant Director General, Economic and Social Development Department at the FAO. And he will give us an updated summary of the potential impacts of COVID-19. But before he begins, Ruchi will outline the format of how we're going to proceed here.
Thank you, Nettie, and thank you everyone for joining. So we are hoping to divide this interaction in two parts. The first part, we will have 6 panelists who will reflect on the question of what are the current and likely impacts of COVID-19 on food systems and the right to food. So we should have around an hour for that interaction, including from the participants. And then for the second half, we will look at what measures have been taken so far to ensure food security and the right to food against the backdrop of COVID-19. We would want to hear from you what's working, what's not, and what coordinated global policy responses are needed around food governance in light of COVID-19. So that's the second part. We have requested each of the panelists to speak for 5 minutes to begin with, so we can have more interactions, except for Mr. Maximo Torero, who has to leave after the first interaction, although his colleague Michael Clark would be with us for the remainder of the time. If people have any interventions, please type them in the chat box. We have some colleagues who are helping us keep track of your interventions. We will be recording this webinar. So with your permission, we would like to record this webinar so that those who are not able to join can also hear our deliberations. And we will try and consolidate the reflections and questions at the end of the webinar as well. So please keep suggesting in the chat box. We have a registration form that Teresa is pasting in the chat box. Please take time to fill in the registration so that we can connect and contact you again. Thank you. And with that, we would like to really invite Mr. Maximo Torero for his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me please share my screen so that we can see the presentation I'm going to do. Okay, I hope you can see the screen. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to present what FAO has been working and what is the assessment we have up to now of this complex, very complex situation for everybody, not only for farmers, but also for every citizen of the world, but especially for the most vulnerable people, which are in most of the cases in rural areas. First, let me explain what we know. And I will be very factual based on information we have been collecting, in many cases real time. This is, for example, a combination of the Johns Hopkins COVID cases database, together with the prevalence of undernourishment information that we collect and we develop at FAO, what we call the POU. As you can see here, the big red dots are the number of cases. And most of the bigger number of cases are in the northern part of the world. And they are increasing in the South America part, but also they are starting to enter in Africa and South Asia. What that means is that we still have a little window of time to protect Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and to help work with them to increase their resilience, because those are the areas, and that is the green color shades of the countries, where the prevalence of undernourishment is the biggest. And that's where the index of health capacities is the lowest. Although in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, they have a lot of experience on pandemics and they know how to handle situations. Although the case of COVID-19 is a very different case to Ebola even, and to the SARS, because in the case of Ebola, a patient will transmit when he's in the bed. In the case of COVID-19, a patient is transmitting while he's walking. So the possibility of the spread is a lot more higher than the case of Ebola. So we need to be very careful, because we need to try to minimize the potential spread and also increase the resilience and assure that these populations, which are extremely undernourished, don't get affected even more, because that will be even more dramatic. Now, one of the things that we have been trying to do is to increase awareness of the importance of keeping alive the supply chain. 2 or 3 weeks ago, when we started doing, nobody was talking about the food supply chain. They were only talking about the health, which is correct. Health is first. But there is no way we can have health if we don't have food, and especially in vulnerable countries. So our job was to bring this up and to try to make policymakers understand of the importance of keeping the food supply chain alive, not only to supply food, but also because the poorest people are farmers, are small farmers and smallholders, and they need to keep doing their activities to assure their well-being. But this requires also to incorporate protocols and to keep the health of these workers okay. And that's where the major investment needs to be done if we want to assure that the food supply chain can keep operating. So governments have to carefully look at this and trying to figure out solutions. And we're trying to bring best practices around this that we are learning from many countries so that this can be implemented. Now, the second step for us was to understand what were the channels of transmission and why. Because the situation that we're living today is very different to the situation of 2007, 2008. And we need to be very, very clear on this. We are not in the same situation. This could be even a worse situation, but it is not a food crisis because of scarcity. Food is available, and I will explain what I mean by this. The problem here is that we have two types of shocks. We have a food supply shock because of the lockdowns, and we also have a demand shock, which will become deeper as weeks move because of the recession. Now, on the supply side, we need to be sure that inputs are delivered. We need to be sure that the value chain keeps operating. But we also need to be sure that labor, which is used for harvest in most developing countries and in developed countries, can keep moving, keeping the health protocols that need to be put in place. This means being tested, masks, physical distance, and gloves. So those protocols have to be in place, but the only way the food supply chain will keep operating is if we allow these things to operate. On the demand side, we need to be sure that there will be a recession, and that will mean that the demand for food in the next months will be lower, and that will substantially affect prices of food. So we need to be alerted, and this will create problems to the farmers, severe problems, because they won't get the income they were getting before. It will be significantly lower if they can access the markets, and that will affect their well-being. Then we have the trade part, and here is where we need to bring clarity to the market. Many countries, or few countries now, thanks God, have imposed trade restrictions or trade bans. The most important one still is the one in rice, which has created some small spike in prices in rice, and that's, I hope, will be released soon. There are others, like the quota of wheat put by Russia, but the quota is big enough to assure the same trade of wheat, but the reason they did it is because they want at least some wheat to stay for their own production, because as the exchange rate devaluates, it's more profitable for exporters to export everything, but the quota helps them to control that situation. And that is the macroeconomic channel also, which is the channel of exchange rates. So all these channels, which I rank them from 1 to 4, are affecting our supply chain, and they go from the supply to the demand side. Now, the logistical part, which is linked to the arrows in certain way, is one of the major problems that we are facing. So the reason why we are saying let's keep the food supply chain is because we need to resolve the logistical problem. It's not because there is a scarcity of food in the production side. If we split the world of production into the staple world and the high-value commodities, so staples are wheat, maize, corn, soybeans, and rice, and the high-value commodity are fruits and vegetables and meats. In the staple world, it's very capital-intensive, very few labors in the supply side. Is the exporting countries, of course, and it has a very good supply this year, and it has a lot of reserves at the world level, which are more than twice what it was in 2007, 2008. And that's the big difference, okay? 2007 and 2008, we have a scarcity. Here, we don't have a scarcity. The problem is how we move this food from the harvest areas to the ports, and then to be able to export it to many countries which need, because they are import-dependent countries. And that is the case of several countries in Africa, for example. And that's where the logistical information has to come up to avoid any panic reaction from governments. Initially, there were some logistical problems in moving these commodities in Brazil, in other countries, and those have been resolved, and governments have worked to resolve those problems. So, for example, if I look at where the wheat and the maize comes for Africa, it mostly comes from South America. And all those logistical problems have been resolved. The only problem we observe today in terms of staples is a problem of vessels staying more time in the ports. On the other hand, we have the high-value commodities, and those are fresh fruits and vegetables, meats, and fish, and so on. And those have been severely affected because they are labor-intensive, so we need a lot of labor to harvest, to produce them, and they are a lot more sensitive to the logistical problems because they are perishable. That's where the lockdowns are really affecting the labor market, the labor supply, and that's why in Europe, for example, farmers, they don't have the labor force to do the harvest, and they are asking for it. In France, they are asking people to help in the process of harvest. In Spain, the same. In the US, there were significant problems at the beginning because in California, because of the visas issues, the consulates were closed. And all those problems have to start to be resolved. And it can be within the health protocols that need to be in place. But then the logistical part also needs to be solved. But again, look at the two sides of the coin. So today, we will face some uncertainty, and we're trying to resolve that, bringing information on real time on solutions to the logistical problems. But the other side of the coin is what will happen tomorrow when the demand side will be a lot lower. And those producers of fruits, which are trees and which will have products next year, will be facing a very low demand. And therefore, they will be affected in terms of the prices they will be receiving. And in many cases, it will increase left in the field, so losses, post-harvest losses, and also waste because the produce cannot be made. And we are observing, for example, all the closures of restaurants already have affected the high end of the food, like chocolate industry, coffee industry, fishery industry have been substantially affected because of the lockdowns of planes, and also because of the closure of restaurants across the world. And it will also affect smallholder farmers, which won't be able to go to markets. And in Africa, for example, they will go to open markets. If they are locked down, that won't be able to happen. So we need to work in trying to find solutions to minimize that problem. Now, this is basically a map showing real-time information on location of potential port restrictions and port bans. As I was saying, if we look at the real-time flow of vessels today, we don't see too much of a change. The only change we are observing, despite of these restrictions, are two things. One is slowdowns in deployment of the containers because of less labor in the ports, which are capital intensive, and that can be resolved. And two, we are observing that the crew cannot move out. And the crew has a capacity of 6 months to be in the vessels. More than that, they cannot do. And we are already 2 months to 3. So we have to be careful with that because that could put a binding constraint. In certain countries, like in the northern part of Africa, and this is the deep color, the number of days that the vessel stays in the port has increased. So it has moved from 1 to 2 to 2.5. And that's costly for the exporter. Okay, but it's not a restriction, it's more slow. And that needs to be resolved. It's a logistical issue that needs to be resolved. And countries are working to try to resolve these problems. But if I look at the flow of vessels, for example, for sub-Saharan Africa from the south, South America, which is mostly from where it comes, the vessels are flowing, okay? And we also know, for example, this is what happened with the Russian export quota. The yellow line shows what happened today. The quota came in week number 10. The horizontal axis gives the weeks. Look how the exports and the mobility of vessels spiked to the other 2 years, the gray and the orange line, just before the quota. So information was flowing of the quota happening. So they push out the wheat before the quota was put in place. And then we return to normal. If I compare across the weeks, the last 14 weeks in real time, compared to the same weeks of the previous years, you will see that the flow of vessels with food, with the staple foods, is more or less the same right now. This is a staple food. Now, the major problem on the staple world is the exchange rate. That's one, apart from the logistical, is the exchange rate. Because most of the countries are facing devaluation of the exchange rate. What that means is more attractive for exporters. It's less attractive for importers. It's more costly. And that's where countries need to assess what policies they can put in place so that the consumers are not affected because this increase on price because of imported goods. Now, if we look at prices, we will see that for wheat, prices are going down in futures. If we look at maize, prices are going down. And if we look at soybeans, also we observe prices going down at the global level. The only case where we observe, please, if somebody can mute their mic, because I think it's somebody from CSM. I think the organizer can mute all the mics.
Exactly.
Luca, can you please mute your mic? Thank you.
Okay. Sí.
Okay, so if we look at rice, because of the ban putting the export of rice by one of big exporters, The rice is the only case that has increased, and that is very sensitive to Africa, especially to West Africa, which is a net importer of rice. Now, what is the thing that we know? And this comes from the Agricultural Market Information System. Look at the stocks of different commodities in the world. They're substantially higher than 2007 and 8. So we cannot say that we are in a crisis because of scarcity today, because we are not in terms of staples. Okay, what we can say is that there is a logistical problem, and we need to find ways to resolve them, and these are being resolved. And we need to resolve that now, so that countries get the correct signal, and we avoid countries putting export restrictions, because that could create a problem. So basically, we will be building our own food crisis. When we already have an enormous crisis, we don't need another one. Also, we need to understand the other side of the coin. With this level of reserves, and with the good harvest that we have this year, when the recession hits harder, prices will be very low. And that will affect all the production side, all the farmers. Now, the step 3 that we are doing is trying to understand by country level, what are the channels that affect each country of this transmission drawing that I presented. And here you can see for every country, and you can download the document from the website of FAO, what are the channels where they have in red the major problem that they need to resolve. And this is very important because it allows to customize policies to resolve the problems that they are facing. Now, what to do? And that's basically our job, trying to help countries and work with countries to find solutions to the problems that they will be facing, because this situation is, I think, is even worse than the Spanish flu, because it affects everybody in the world, every country of the world. It's worse than the recession of 1930. For sure, it's worse than the food crisis, and it's worse than the recession of 2011. Why? Because we are affecting every country in the world, and it's not a group that is okay and a group that is not okay. And this will exacerbate the consequences because of inequality. That's what we're going to face, because the most vulnerable ones are the ones that will be able to cope less. And that's where governments need to activate and work very fast. So we are bringing best practices. We have developed a series of briefs with best practices. We have developed a database with best practices that we are also learning real time from countries. We are following all the policies with the Food and Agricultural Policy Decision Analysis tool, FABDA. And we're also monitoring prices with big data real time. So we're looking at changes in prices at the country level on real time. And we're also doing roundtables with the private sector and also with the civil society, with farmers, to try to understand what are the challenges they are facing. What we need to do, first and foremost, is emergency food assistance, nutrition interventions, and safety nets needs to be enhanced. And here we need to learn what and scale up what we know that is working. We don't need to invent new things. We have a problem with the school feeding programs because of the lockdowns. There are already best practices in place that we have documented where countries can do an alternative to that for 2 reasons: to keep feeding the children, and the second reason is to keep using the work of the farmers, which are feeding those school feeding programs. So it's very important to find alternatives quickly with food banks and other mechanisms to minimize the potential consequence. We need to scale up horizontally and vertically all the safety net mechanisms. Now, when I mention horizontally, it's because there will be other areas where we will be facing problems. Now we are used to the areas and the crisis locations where we have identified them in every food crisis country. But this could expand to other locations because of the out-migration as a consequence of the lockdowns and the pandemic. So we need to find all the different mechanisms to help and support the most vulnerable people, the people that we have already targeted. And we are trying to do a global assessment with our food insecurity experience scale to identify where these new hotspots of undernourishment and extreme situations will be. The second thing, which is really important, is increase in food availability from a small farmer production. We need to help the smallholders because the lockdowns don't allow them to go to market. We need to find solutions on how we can reduce the physical distance because we need to protect their health. I think the administrator can mute.
Thanks.
We need to find solutions for smallholder farmers because they are very vulnerable and they will be losing their harvest. For example, in Africa, what we are doing is identifying with their crop calendars where they can harvest still before the big lockdown and where they can plant for the next year before the big lockdown. Then the issue is how to handle that harvest because you don't want it to go to loss or waste. And that's where storage facilities and trying to accelerate investment from the money that will be flowing from the MDBs, from the multilateral development banks, is crucial. But we need to address their problems. We need to assure that they will have the inputs for the next planting season. Because if they are able to plant now, they can go in lockdowns, and then they come back and they are able to harvest. Now, again, but keep in mind the other side of the coin. They will be facing lower prices. So how we help them through storage mechanisms with cooling chains and so on, so that they can smooth and increase the resilience in the next months until things get to normal, which could take 6 months to 12. So it's very important to start working, giving them access to liquidity to be able to operate. But we have to think carefully here. It's not just dumping money with no logic. I think we need to take this as an opportunity to use these resources to find solutions to structural problems that can help them in the future. It could be this year there will be losses, but in the future it will be important. Now, who we know are mostly affected right now? The fishery industry. The high value commodities are affected, fruits, vegetables. Vegetables are not too traded, they are traded more locally, but they are affected. Fruits will be very affected because of the lower demand. Flowers, the market of flowers has been destroyed. So every sector, countries need to assess the sector that is affected so that they can support them and they can help them so that they can keep them alive and operating. The next thing is to be very careful with the issues on trade and tax policies. Our job is to bring information, and our job is to tell the world what is the reality. And the reality is that in the staples, we have food. The reality is that there were logistical problems that are being resolved. The reality today is that the vessels are moving. And that's real-time information of mobility of vessels. This is not media, this is not newspapers, this is not the stories, it's real-time information of mobility of vessels. And that reality, the worst that a country can do is to panic buy in staples to build up reserves. Why? Because tomorrow the price will be a lot cheaper. Because prices are going to fall more even. So be careful. We need to be careful what we advise governments and how we work, because that is the reality. And I am not inventing. This is real-time information that we are working on. Also, we need to be very sure the countries need to assess how they can compensate local markets that import because of the exchange rate that will make imports more expensive. And there are several tools like reducing taxes to imports, reducing VAT, many options, but governments need to assess each one because for every one it will be different. This implies a reduction in revenues, but they need to figure it out. And it's good what the G20 did in terms of giving them an option of not paying their loans until the end of the year. Of course, it would have been better that they exonerate them from paying, but that's what happened. But that gives them some flexibility of liquidity to be able to operate and to do these mechanisms to resolve problems that they are facing today. And finally, we also need to look at the macroeconomic implications because they will affect the situation and they will assure you how much you can support. And we need to be careful because you don't want to create more crises over what we are facing today. But the point that I want to make, and I finalize here, is that please, let's look at the two sides of the coin. Right now, it will be a mistake to create a food crisis when there is no food crisis. We have to be pragmatic. We have to resolve logistical problems as fast as possible. But we need to be very worried on the incomes of farmers next year because of the lower prices as a result of the recession. That's, for me, the crisis. What will happen because of the recession? I don't think we have a problem of scarcity of food today. It's a problem of the income, that all these rural areas will be affected because of the huge recession and the reductions on flow of food. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. An in-depth look at some key aspects of the food system. I thank you very much, and we're sorry you have to leave because that was very provocative, and I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions. I would just remind everybody who is joining, please register and please mute your mics so that all of us can clearly hear the next speaker, whom Ruchi will introduce.
Great, thank you. So we would now like to invite Mr. Francesco Brava from WHO. So you have 5 minutes. If you're able to talk through to the first question, which is looking at the impact, the potential impact, and in the second round, we will look at some of the solutions. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation, and good afternoon to all. So, yeah, I will basically discuss what might be an additional impact on malnutrition of the current pandemic. And in order to do this, we need to remember what the current status of the nutrition targets is. We define malnutrition in terms of wasting, overweight of children under 5, in terms of women's anemia, in terms of obesity in adults. So the recent estimates that WHO, together with UNICEF and World Bank, has published indicate that the number of children with stunting, with reduced growth, is now down to 144 million. So there is a trend in reducing this number, but the largest number is still in South Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, in Sub-Saharan Africa, while the prevalence is more or less constant, the actual number is increasing. Then we have wasting low weight for the height of children, the more acute forms of malnutrition, which is reaching about 7% of the children. About 47 million are affected. And then we still have overweight on the rise in children under 5, but particularly around adults. And then we have about 600 million women in reproductive age which are anemic. Now, this is a situation which is further going to be affected by the pandemic. Of course, there will be geographical differences, and as you've seen in the presentation of Maximo, at the moment, the part of the world that are most largely affected are actually the high-income countries, but we are concerned about the expansion, particularly to South Asia. Now, what could be the mechanism for an increased malnutrition rate? Now, first of all, as you heard from Maximo, food insecurity and the effects of markets on prices, on agricultural production, on logistics. But then a separate mechanism is the care practices. We have seen that isolation or even separation of mothers and children may affect childcare practices and therefore affect nutritional status. There is, in fact, a recommendation of some countries to reduce breastfeeding. WHO does and UNICEF do not endorse that recommendation. It's important that children continue to be breastfed. There could be an increase, of course, in morbidities. But perhaps the most concerning mechanism would be the of health systems. We know that already in high-income countries there is a decrease in coverage of immunization. We're concerned about the continuity of certain essential nutrition services such as vitamin and mineral supplementation, or even programs to manage acute malnutrition. So the continuity of programs is at the moment the challenge, also because a lot of the health workers are reconverted, repurposed to address the epidemic. So we have a major issue about continuity of nutrition programs, more than we already have. Making the nutritional situation worse is also a way to facilitate the spread of the pandemic, because poor nutrition, as you know, depresses immunity and therefore makes the response to the virus weaker. What we have seen in areas affected by the pandemic is that the quality of the diet deteriorates. We don't have solid data about that, but we have seen clearly an increase in the consumption of packaged food and drinks. Some countries indicate that people are also confined at home and with less physical activity have higher weight gain. there is a problem of access and availability of fresh foods by particularly some of the most vulnerable groups who have been confined and whose purchasing power is affected by the overall crisis. So the unemployment is responsible for that, but also the fact that certain individuals, particularly elderly people, have a reduced mobility and therefore do not have access and availability of fresh food. Final point is that there is clearly a connection between the obesity, diabetes, and diet-related non-communicable diseases and the severity of the impact of the pandemic. This has been observed both in China and in the other countries affected by the pandemic. Obesity is, and its complications are indeed a risk factor. So this is yet another reminder that nutritional status has to be good, and unless we have low rates of different forms of malnutrition, and unless we have healthy diet, we're also in a much worse situation to be able to fight the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Branca, for really highlighting the crucial silent challenge and crisis that of nutrition that many countries are facing. I've already heard from India of cancelling of some of the nutrition programs. It's really serious. Thank you for highlighting that, and we will pick up on some of the solutions in the next session. So I'll pass over to Nettie to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to introduce Dr. Olivia Yambi. Olivia, are you on the screen? I'm not seeing you. Yes. Hi. All right. She is the co-chair of IPES-Food and a senior consultant on nutrition and sustainable development who served as UNICEF country representative in Kenya for some years and has quite a few senior positions in the UN system. She does research on infant and young child feeding, and I'll turn it over to you for a 5-minute response to the question.
I just want to talk to because it seems that Francesco. There is some background noise.
Would everyone please mute?
Sorry, it's this. Yeah, CSM Secretariat. Please mute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nettie. The reason I had removed the video is because I'm sitting in an environment where the bandwidth is extremely limited. So in order to be able to converse, I may have to shut off the video. First of all, as we discuss this issue, my thoughts are obviously with those who are currently affected, those who are sick, families that have suffered loss, and everyone that is providing care and support during this very, very extremely trying period. So in order to discuss what are the current likely impacts, my colleagues, 2 colleagues who spoke before me covered a lot of the global issues. And I think it would be very important to have a feel on who is likely to suffer most from the impacts of a dysfunctional and unjust food system, so that we can make sure that appropriate measures are addressed to these groups, both short-term in order to address the immediate challenges, but also in the long term in order to address the vulnerability and poverty creating processes, so that we are, yes, engaging in a rescue mode, but also we would want to move into sustaining the gains that have been made. IPES-Food, the organization that I'm attached to right now as a member of the panel of experts, has recently issued a communique in which we looked at the symptoms, causes, and potential solutions to the current crisis. And I'm aware that we will be discussing the actions in the next tranche of discussion. But for now, to say that we are fully aware that the impacts from a dysfunctional food system, much as there's plenty of food out there, as Maximo has pointed out, the impacts are likely to be very severe amongst those whose rights are far from realized. And the people whose right to food and nutrition is compromised are likely to have their right to health, right to education, right to care and protection, the whole gamut of indivisible rights actually not realized, not fulfilled. So the challenge goes beyond just addressing our food systems, but we would need to look, and other groups are looking into this, how universal health coverage is playing out, how access to education in an environment where many countries, and now I'm thinking mainly of countries in Africa, many countries have closed schools. So if there was an issue around the children being able to access a meal at school, that is gone. And the burden on feeding children weighs disproportionately heavier on those households that are on minimum levels of income. And Francesco has already pointed out to the impacts, potential impacts on dietary diversity. And what I see in Tanzania, in the open markets, which is where most people go source their foods, because of restrictions on movements, people go out to the market maybe once a week. They don't have storage facilities. Therefore, their dietary diversity is being heavily compromised. And this is not the population that will stock up on canned produce, because in their construct, this does not exist. So with food being available, access issues are major. There's a whole fragility of people's access to both essential goods as well as services, including the very health services that are supposed to facilitate, support people in being tested and being provided with appropriate care. So what I see the impact of this pandemic is that inequalities will be exacerbated because we are not starting off from a level playing field, and policy decisions will definitely need to move towards realization of all human rights, and for this discussion, particularly to the right to food and nutrition. There will be, if the health impacts are exacerbated, there will be inability for the productive workforce. In many countries in Africa, it's the older people who are farming, and if these are getting sick, they will eventually be unable to sow seeds because of their physical condition, but also those seeds might have been consumed in order to bridge the gap in market failures in provisioning for food. There might also be consequences in the long run on loss of land, where the whole issue of security of tenure is being compromised. One fundamental area I see that we need to engage on, and this we will be expanding upon on the actions and policy measures, would be actually learning lessons from other disasters we have gone through, including the HIV and AIDS pandemic, on engagement of communities, looking at measures of resilience and not leaving everything to the office bearers and professionals to carve out all necessary actions, because communities are ready to engage. They are framing measures around governance of the food system in their locales. And I cannot emphasize more on the importance of ensuring adequate access to food, and maintenance of dietary diversity, which I see as immediate challenges as people cope with disease and reduced access to incomes. So I will stop there for now because many of the points have been covered by the first two speakers.
Thank you, Olivia, for that very profound and clear insight in what's happening on the ground and some of the responses to it. We'll move on. Ruchi, would you introduce the next participant here?
Yes, thank you. So it's my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Ramu from, who's the Executive Director for Center for Sustainable Agriculture in Hyderabad, India, who would be talking about the impacts he's seeing already in this first intervention. Welcome, Dr. Ramu. You're on mute still. Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Ruchi, and good evening, all. Coming from India, one of the things we have seen in the last 1 month is a significant impact on the smallholder agriculture, where in India more than 55% of the people depend on agriculture directly. And in that, near about 85% are smallholders and small farmers. And in the small farmers agriculture, near about 40% actually comes from wages, the daily wages work which they do in other farm, and also some of the family members who migrated to urban areas. When these two are affected, the significant chunk of income for the farmers is being affected. This 1 month period which has happened. Second, in terms of the impact, if you see, already the smallholder agriculture is in deep crisis, and if you look from income, indebtedness, the net profits which farmers get from the production, and in terms of risk of crop failures, either due to pest and diseases or due to the climate change, and are increasing, and already there's a large number of farmer suicides which are happening, and then the migration from rural to urban areas. And this situation, which is already visible about the farmers' distress, has become much more compounded by the COVID lockdown, because it was suddenly announced, and the seasonal harvest was ready, and then they couldn't harvest, and that resulted in loss of incomes, both in terms of prices going down, because there is no demand in the urban areas. The prices have gone down significantly. Wages have gone down because there is no work opportunities, and in many cases farmers even couldn't harvest their crops. So there is also yield loss which has happened. So this compound effect on farmers will be significant, because when we talk about, say, fresh fruits and vegetables, and near about 60% of their income comes from these 3 months, April, May, June. In the annual calendar, if you see these 3 months, they get the best prices normally. And these three, now the prices are less than half of what it was last year. So that's the situation of fresh fruits and vegetables. And this effect is also because much of the F&B market in India is unorganized, and consumption is also very large. Consumption is also the unorganized, the labor who depend on their daily wages. So when they are affected by because there's no work for them, and also because of this trade which happens, the small scale petty shops as well as the roadside vendors, and all these are affected because of the lockdown. So all these together has brought down the market of fresh fruits and vegetables by over 60% in urban areas. In rural areas, it's much higher. And this resulted in the significant reduction in the wages of the incomes of the people. One more important issue we need to look at is when government has a lot of food security schemes, they focus only on supply of rice and wheat. Not more than that, and even to buy the rest of the things, whether to buy pulses or to buy vegetables. There's no money and there is no opportunity also. I think that has affected significantly, and if this is going to continue for a while, and the impact is going to be much more significant. And the fresh sowing and then labor operations which need to be done in the farms also has not affected in the country. So this will also have a long-term impact on the crops in the coming season also. So it's going to be a seasonal impact. The distress migration which happened from urban areas to rural areas also will have a significant impact, because it has improved almost 30 to 40% of the people who migrated to rural areas may stay back in the rural areas, as the opportunities in the urban seems to be very constricted. And if they stay back in the rural areas, again the competition for labor work will increase, and then the labor wages may further go down. And also a competition for tenancy will increase, and the tenancy cost for the land also may go up. So the farmers, the smallholder farmers and agricultural labor who are under already deep crisis, their livelihoods may fall into much more deeper crisis in the next few months. Given that if you look at the government's initiatives, they simply supplied few food items and then they just kept quiet. Doesn't seems to be the government interventions doesn't seems to be responding to the crisis which smallholder agriculture is facing. I think from that point of view, from the livelihoods point of view, is what developing countries should look at, because large number of people also depend on production and production-based livelihoods. It's not just crop production, but also a production-based livelihood, so in rural areas. I think that's what the Indian situation is about.
Thank you, Dr. Ramu, for painting that picture. And it's quite a heartbreaking picture emerging from India. So our solidarity with you. We will come back in the next round to you again. Over to you, Nettie. Thank you.
So the next intervener here, you can see from the range of interveners what a great depth and breadth of expertise is being brought to this conversation. Our next speaker is Sophia Murphy, who is a senior specialist in agriculture, trade, and investment within the Economic Law and Policy Program of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And I'll give the floor to her for some insights into, well, go ahead, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Nettie. Thanks, everyone. Greetings from the west coast of Canada. We've got a big range of geography on the call today. I'll just try and say a few things, mostly drawing actually some reflections from the last food crisis and now, and not to repeat a lot of what we had heard already, I hope. The first thing to say, I think, is that it is a health crisis, first and foremost, and we don't want to lose sight of that. But it's also a reminder that no crisis is pure, that we live in systems, and so that we immediately see how our right to health, our right to food, our right to work with dignity, these things are all linked, and the entry point's not always the same, and what we need to do isn't always the same. But there's no such thing as a single sector crisis. And the second thing to say is that the shocks are normal. The shock is very distinct and huge in comparison to shocks, but it's not new for the system to face shocks, and they're not all the same. And so that's one of the reasons, I think, why the Committee on Food Security was reformed, because we don't have a simple blueprint whereby there will be no more shocks in the future. What we have is a dynamic series of systems that interact, and so we need to be ready to be able to talk about what to do, to understand what's going on, and to share experiences. And I think that that's the most important outcome of the last food price crisis, in a sense, was the place to talk about it, that is the Committee on World Food Security, for at least the piece that's about global coordination. There are many other levels of governance that have to be considered. And I think the third thing we're reminded of is that this has to be about increasing our resilience. So the first big lesson, I think, from this shock has been the lack of redundancy, the lack of the fact that our supply chains are just in time, quite complex, and we've seen the disruptions happen in local systems as well as in national systems and in international systems, not exactly at the same time, but more or less, all of them affected by different parts of what this pandemic has meant. And so we're not managing our risks still. We didn't manage them in 2007 and 8. We have a different set of risks now. We're still not managing them very well. We have to be about efficiency, but efficiency for nature as well. How do we make best use of all of the resources we have, social, ecological, and economic? And we know the system that we were in, the food systems that we had, were not efficient in that larger understanding of what that means. And we know that it's about equity. We know that although the pandemic is affecting the whole world at the same time, we're not all living the same crisis. I'm living the crisis with a paid income, and my neighbor across the street isn't. And that already makes us very different. Two Canadians living in a small town north of Vancouver. That multiplies so much, of course, across the world. And equity is something we've done a lot of work on. We came out of the last crisis without really dealing with, especially economic inequalities within our countries. And I think the big difference we maybe have this time is that we're equipped with a lot more understanding and knowledge of what those sources of inequality are, what we might do about them. And so in a period of great shock like this, where the governments have been called to the fore, there's no question of governments stepping back or governments letting the markets do something. We need the governments to be in place, whether it's our town council or our national government or our intergovernmental decision-making bodies. And we need them to be, as it were, taking advantage of the crisis to think through how they will deal with the inequalities that the pandemic is confronting us with. Apart from that, though, the crisis is very different. And I don't really want to take a lot more time because I know we're a bit behind schedule, but maybe just a few comparators between the two. So as we've seen, in the first case, we were lacking staple food stocks. That is not the case now. And the first foremost of our sort of, if you think of food security and the four pillars of supply and access, use and stability, it's really the access rather than the supply that is our first challenge. And I would disagree a bit with Maximo. I think we do have a food security crisis. It's just we could see others coming if we don't think about the way this might roll out and how it will affect us. So we need to be thinking about next year's production, but also people's access to food today. Last time we had a food crisis and then an economic crisis and a recession, which deepened poverty, exacerbated inequalities. And this time we've had a health crisis that is triggered an economic crisis that has a food security implication. So there's a different set of mechanisms in place there, and that's very evident in the way governments respond.
Sorry, Sophia, if you could speak a little bit slowly, please, for the interpreters. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. I've been hearing that for 20 years. You think I would learn? I'll just have a few more points to say. I think another thing to say, and it's been coming up in the things that maybe the last point I can emphasize, is this question of the last time around we saw a big land grab, a big increase in interest in investing in land, in food and in production, and access to water as well for food production. And this time around, we're not going to have the same kind of money. We're going to see a recession all around. So we have both abundant supply, low prices, possibly future supply shocks, but we also have governments who are extending all of their possible resources in order to dealing with immediate shock. And so I think we have to think about how that public money is used and not expect a whole surge of private income to come behind it, but to think about how we might need to reorganize our economy and what we do with it in order to find probably other ways to be thinking about the systems we have and who is investing and what kind of investment we want them to make. Because the recession that is coming at the same time is going to change where the, if you like, where the money will sit and the power and the decision making that comes with that. I'm going to leave it there. I think that's more than my 5 minutes already. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophia, for very thoughtful, provocative intervention, which reminds us how many systems are in dynamic interaction in this new, and that this is a new set of problems in many ways, for which we can meet with some of the wisdom of the past, but we will have to be imaginative and collaborative to go forward here. Ruchi, would you introduce the next intervener?
Thank you, Nettie. So it's my pleasure to welcome Mamadou Goita, who's a researcher from Mali. He's the executive director at IRPAD, and he was also the executive director of ROPA. He sits in IPES-Food and was also involved with the Global Agriculture Food Security Trust Fund in the past. So my real pleasure to invite Mamadou and hear about the impact and the potential impact in Africa. Thank you. Sorry, you're on mute, Mamadou. Sorry, we can't hear you. We can't hear you, Mamadou.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we.
Okay. So it will be a bit chaotic because I'm not at the office actually, and I have to take out my headset. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this workshop, with the webinar. I'm really happy to talk about what is happening actually in Africa. As you know, it's a big continent, and with 55 countries, not easy to make a kind of summary of what are the impact of COVID-19 on the life of smallholder farmers in this continent. But I would just emphasize on West Africa, knowing that there are some worst cases elsewhere, but these are average things that are happening actually. As you know, this continent is already in problems before even the COVID pandemic because of some of the policy decisions that are very exclusive for smallholder farmers in most of the countries. As you know, there were commitment in investment in agriculture sector with the Maputo Declaration and the Malabo Declaration later on. But unfortunately, many countries didn't reach. We had less than 10 countries reaching the 10% of their budget to agriculture. But with this pandemic, actually what we can see is that many countries have been just jumping on the propositions that were made by our continent, mainly because we are not affected in terms of numbers, like Europe or North America or even Asia, that Africa has been until now is at the very early stage of the pandemic. Most of the countries are facing cases in all the countries except 2, but they are not that big number as we can see. And most of the villages that are really concerned about production system are not being reached actually because there is no test probably, but you can see of the depth that there is no specific problems at that levels. But having said that, we can see that actually most of the countries have made decisions to lock on. Decisions have been made. And at the same time, some countries, if you take West Africa, like Cote d'Ivoire, like Burkina Faso, like even Niger and Senegal already started locking the markets. So most of the markets have been closed. So the big first impact that we can see is that there is no more space for smallholder farmers to access to those who are usually open to buy the product. So actually, this is if you look at most of the West African countries, this is the vegetable market period for most of the cases. There are some markets that we are having researches on the territorial market, but actually, most of these markets are cannot provide because there is no way for them to access to it. First thing. The second one is that since there is no movement between some villages and the big cities, there is a loss of crops, of course, as I mentioned, but also another key challenge that we are facing is that all the other problems, social services that are provided are completely going down because everybody is concentrating the effort on the pandemic for prevention for some cases, but also for that. So this means that there are so many other things that are happening with malaria, with all the other diseases that exist that are not taken into account in the different intervention that we are having. So this means that there is a lot of challenges with social services, just creating so many problems with smallholders that they don't know what will be the future. So we are not that locked with the pandemic actually, because if you take countries like Mali, we are 143 cases actually, and then in most of the cases there are people are coming out of the disease, but most of the deaths came from France and a few cases from Belgium actually. But at the same time, people don't have access to other options related to other diseases. So this means that people are stopping even going to the farm. And if you add to that, the problem that they have actually on even moving with the production, poverty is really going very, very, very up. It's very, very high actually in most of the other countries. Another problem is that there are some options. We talk about that later on. So not only they have problems selling vegetables, actually this is the period in the region, but preparing for the rainy season that is coming very soon, they have also many, many difficulties accessing to the different factors of production that are useful for preparing. I'm talking about seeds, I'm talking about different related things, even manure, organic manures or mineral manures also, organic manure and others that are needed to be prepared actually for the rainy season starting very soon. So the movement being completely stopped in most of the cases, in most of the countries, so there is a threat that there will be many, many problems going to the farms, but also doing farming in the next month, that is the rainy season starting. Another impact that we can see, beside the factor that people are in some cases have access to the food that they produce in their own regions, but the movement between different regions that are producing different productions is also very problematic, since they cannot access to other kind of exchange of products. So this means that there is already hunger that is stacking some of the regions, and the national solidarity fund that have been voted in most of the countries are not reaching these people yet. They are just caring about people in the cities, but most of those who are producing in these rural areas don't have access to that. So if you look at the relationship between, the linkages between consumers and producers have been broken. Now access to food is the problem, but even if it exists in some of the places, people cannot buy it because most of the economic spheres are stopped, so they cannot access to necessary resources just to produce to access to this food. So this is another big problem that is continuing. But fortunately, I will come back to that. This is also creating internal solidarities between villages, neighboring villages, between also some of the cities, and it's creating also the fact that since most of the territorial market that exists are now used for people just to keep the production that they have in the territory that they are producing these. So it's creating also a kind of a internal marketing system that probably will have an impact in a positive way in the future of these product producers in in the future. I mean, and also we will probably assist in a kind of rebuilding the relationship between consumers and producers. In some cases, I can face that where I have my farm, for instance, that now many consumers are coming back to the villages there to buy food in this market because most of the big markets are closed. So just to sum up, so that we can get to other things, investment problem will be, it's actually one of the key issues that need to be addressed, probably because those who have been producing onions, potatoes, and many of the other okra and other things cannot sell them, but there is no support for them just to access to the resources so that they can produce next year. Secondly, that poverty is going up because of this lack of economic activities related to the to this relationship between market and the production system. And thirdly, that this situation is creating also a big of gaps between borders, because some countries, Burkina and Mali, for instance, or Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso, were sharing a lot of food stuff, but also trade will develop between these countries in terms of access to food also. But this kind of exchange is also destroyed, so destabilizing the local economies of most of these. So with implication of local government and all other things. So I can elaborate more on some of the future issues that I mentioned, access to factors of production because the rainy season is starting, preparing the lands, preparing for the cattle and all these kind of things can be also addressed in the future because it's really problematic actually in most of these countries. So not facing already lack of investment, the bad organization of markets in the past. So it has been amplified actually, and then creating a lot of difficulties to smallholders in their farm, but creating at the same time, as I said, as a hope, solidarity between consumers and producers, and creating also more spaces for farmers to come up with different solutions that they can manage. And probably this year, if you won't have access to mineral manures and all these kind of things, probably will be turning down to the agroecological system, production system that the different factors are available at the local level. So that is also something that may be also considered in terms of good impact that this situation is having on the life of producers in different parts of Africa. So actually, prices are very low where the market exists for farmers. So they are selling at a lower price and then getting less resources for investing in their farms, and the difficulty to access to some other foodstuff with their neighbors is creating also some of the farming problems in some regions in Africa. So I will just stop here and then probably have a chance to discuss more deeply in the questions part of the debate.
Thank you so much, Mamadou, for that really vivid picture of some of the challenges that we are going to start seeing, that we are already seeing, and that we're going to start seeing if farmers are not able to invest in production for next season. With the closing of the borders, I also know from Southern Africa, which was already suffering from a food crisis, as was East Africa. This is coming on top of those existing crises that people are living with. So thank you for that. So Nettie and I suggesting that we actually at this moment open up the floor, because you have been all listening patiently. We have over 100 people, maybe more, because we have the French and the Spanish calls as well. So what we suggest is that if you are able to raise your hand in the chat box, if you can see that, or type in the chat, we will call upon you, and we suggest that you also please start thinking of solutions. So what we will do is we will invite the panelists at the end to come up with their closing remarks on policy coherence and solutions. But for the moment, we would like to open the floor for the next 20 minutes for all of us on the call, especially also looking at some of the solutions to the food crisis that will only be exacerbated by COVID, as we've heard so beautifully from many of our colleagues. I know we had some questions, so as you are waiting to also see help from Nettie to see if anyone has their hands raised. We have received a number of questions in the chat box that we have made a note of, and we are going to direct them to the panelists. Quite a number of questions were for FAO, especially asking Mr. Maximo. His analysis was based on a macroeconomic analysis, but the impact is, what is the microeconomic dimension of the crisis? And also there was reflection from Musa that there is already a food scarcity. So how can we say that we have comfortable food supplies? Number of people have asked questions around drop in food prices, what measures can be taken to protect farmers' incomes. So those are some of the questions that have come so far. They have been addressed to some panelists, including Sophia. If you're able to include them in your response towards the end, that would be brilliant. So the floor is open, please, for the participants.
I am at the moment not seeing any hands up as I scroll down, but if someone does want to enter this conversation, we specifically organized this because we want to respect the depth of expertise that many of you who are participants here bring to this conversation, and we're persuaded that this crisis and this moment in our history is one where we really need a plethora of perspectives and the wisdom of the many to meet the challenges. So that's why we want to hear if there's anyone who wants to put something on the table here or remind us of something. Okay, Musa, I see your hand is up.
We have, and we also have the Iranian ambassador who had raised his hand already.
Okay, well, can we go to the Iranian ambassador first then? And then Musa, you'll be the second intervener here. Please.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
First of all, I really need to appreciate CSM for arranging such a platform for discussion, particularly let us now to see the situation from different angles, particularly from the food security sort of situation. And of course, all of us know that this is the coronavirus for the first degree, of course, like earthquake, change the whole setting. And then after the earthquake, we would have the economical tsunami. And after economic tsunami, we would have a flood, which we call it a food flood, the flood which actually changed the whole situation on the food situation and food setting and food security and so forth. Therefore, it's very good for us to now and to look at the situation beforehand, before we reach to the problem. And of course, since this is the unknown, very rapid, very radical sort of change, no any academic, no any institution have any solution for that, because this is a real new unknown phenomenon or unknown hidden enemy. That's why we need to learn from each other. We need to learn from the experience. My major point, which I was going to raise with the organizer of this platform, was that the first and the most important source of learning for us, what was the impact of this coronavirus and what we can do as the best lesson learned for solution, is to actually look at the cases, look at the countries which are infected much more deeply during last 100 days, because this is not more than 100 days crisis. Therefore, we need to look at the cases. And my best sort of suggestion to that issue is to have much more deeper understanding about what happened in the country, which was the first actual victim of the coronavirus, China, which of course more than 500 million people was locked down for a longer term than all European and us. And in Near East and North Africa, of course, the worst case is Iran, and in sort of Europe, Italy. Therefore, I think the cases that can be summarized, if be selected from these three countries, would be much more thoughtful, much more actually informative in terms of learning lesson from the experience, and give us much more solution. In China, one of the examples that I can give you that unfortunately was not reflected, and we have no any presenter from China as far as I can see, 500 people which was locked down was really supported by the digital system of distribution system. And all of them actually supported the small, medium farmers, particularly small farmers, to send their vegetables during the lockdown for more than 1 month, every day, daily, to help the elderly people, which was in the urban cities. And it was with a very, very low cost. And actually that helps a lot in terms of helping the support system, distribution system, and bring 3 million jobs. 3 million jobs in the case of coronavirus, which most of the sort of ordinary urban people or peripheral rural people have no any job for delivery of the products from the village and from the farms to the elderly people in the home, which was a hopeless people. Therefore, this type of system, you can see this is a multidimensional, and nobody think about it before in such a crisis, but that was the best lesson learned, in my understanding, from China, which actually feed 500 million people, bring 3 million jobs, and supported several hundred million farmers, which without this sort of system, faced with a big, huge sort of problem. That's one example. I can give you some from Iran and in Italy, something like that. Therefore, I think for this lesson learned experience, better to base on evidences and the countries which have longer term of infection with this disease and the lesson learned and experience and so on. And I think this is the procedural type of suggestion. And in terms of content, I wrote it down already that I fully agree with the sort of Torero about the issue and do not make the sort of any sort of threat for the people. But we need to look at the situation. The theory is one thing, the practice is something else. And we need to look at the both sides of the picture and actually look at the situation from a higher level in terms of bird view thinking, in terms of relationship between industry, service sector and agricultural sector. And of course, we do believe that all things that they mention are really very true. But there are lots of sort of issues that we cannot see. The best example I can give you is sanction. In no any of this model, the issue of sanction is mentioned. 72 countries in the world are under the sanction. And when you are under the sanction, of course, now, according to all these theoretical things, the whole movement of the production, the agricultural sector, the inputs for agriculture are under the pressure and the problem. That's why I'm thinking the theory is very good, but we need to put it in the practice, and the best practice is to learn from the countries which are infected with the disease so far longer than us, and 100 days is the best period for learning from the other countries. Thank you very much. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the intervention and the reminder how complex this is, how many levels it has, how much we have to learn from each other, and of course that this is a policy, the sanction question. This is a political and policy question as well. I'll turn to Musa very briefly, and then Judith Hitchman. We'll have to make these brief because we want to return also back to turn the question to the panelists so that they can respond to that second question of where we go from here. Musa.
Thank you very much. Nettie, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. I also would want to thank the organizers of this webinar session. I have a third question for the first speaker. That's the Deputy Director General Economics and whatever from FAO. I seem to understand that all the follow-up the previous presenter except him did mention that there is food scarcity because it has different dimensions with regards to labor, inputs, all the others. And I also want to know from him where did he get his data or evidence to say that there is no food scarcity in the world? Because we have different speakers from different parts of this continent. We have from Africa, we have from Asia, but they all did mention that there is scarcity, because scarcity would have to come along with other challenges, which are economical, it could be social, it could be, in the form of labor and input. Where did he get his evidence with regards to the data and the data that he has presented? And my other question is going to Sophia. This one is going to Sophia. The fact that she has also mentioned that there is a problem of access and not availability. What does that mean? Because if there is, there is no problem of access, how can there be problem of availability then? Because I think availability have to really precede the accessibility. But she said there is no problem of access. We only have problem of availability. If I did get the question right, I would want to know how to clarify that better. My last question basically goes to the Executive Director, Center for Sustainable Agriculture, where he mentioned that the opportunities and the seasonal impact, the migration in terms of labor and the migration from urban to rural to urban migration, the increase of labor costs, the increase in the cost of tenants, and the number of people depending on their production. How is this connected to the remittances that most of the Africans get from the West? Because we know that right now there is lockdown. Most of the families in Africa and Asia depend on remittances that are coming from the West. So if there are lockdown, there are no movements, it means the remittance will be affected. That subsequently would also affect families that are dependent on remittances. How is that labor affecting the remittances in this particular case? Thank you.
Thank you, Musa. Can we move on with some other questions, and then I'll ask Sophia and the other panelists to respond when they come back on? All right. So then Judith, a brief intervention, and then Tonti Benado, and then we'll hear from the chair of the CFS.
Thank you very much, Nettie, and thank you, Ruchi, and thank you to everybody for this really great seminar. I just wanted to come back on the question of the short food chains and give you a little additional information on China and also other countries. First of all, there is no country in the world to date where community-supported agriculture distribution has been stopped, because it has been possible to adapt very, very rapidly, either to home deliveries or to distribution that allows distancing in a very simple and easy way. In China, all three levels of government supported the network, which is a couple of 100,000 people strong, and there was over 300% increase in demand. In Europe, we are seeing also a huge surge in community-supported agriculture demand, but also other direct supply chains from producers to consumers. There are totally new platforms springing up on a completely voluntary, not-for-profit basis, putting producers and consumers in touch online, I mean, that is not just in Europe. I know it's happening, for example, in Indonesia and in many countries around the world. The online contacts and WhatsApp groups have been extremely useful in facing all of this. My real questions are, how can we capitalize on all of this? How can we avoid going back to the business as usual? Because this is really the proof that producers can earn a decent living and consumers can have access to fresh, healthy, nutritious food through local and territorial food systems. And Mamadou also emphasized the importance of the direct producer-consumer relationship, either through markets or groups of various kinds, and producer-consumer farmers markets and producer-consumer shops and cooperatives. So we need to look at how to avoid going back to business as usual.
Thanks.
Thank you, Nettie.
And the next intervention, a brief intervention from Tonti Benada, and then I'd like to turn to the chair of the CFS, and then we'll move into the next component of this two-short webinar. So, Tonti. I'm not seeing an intervention. Can you? We can't hear you, I'm sorry. We can't hear you. Can we? No, I'm sorry. We can't hear you. Can we move to the?
Yes, thank you very much.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
The CSM.
Can we move on to the ambassador while we resolve this technical problem?
Sorry, Tonti, we can't hear you. Can you please type in the chat box? Your line is breaking. Tonti, could you please?
Please type your question. The technology is not allowing us to hear you. Please type your question into the chat, and we'll move on to Mr. Tanawati Asen, please.
Thank you very much for allowing me to talk during this webinar, which actually I think I'm talking in the capacities of permanent representative of Thailand, which just would like to share some experience of Thailand that we are facing during the coronavirus pandemic at this moment. As all of us know, not only the health system, but also the food system at the country level, at the global level, are being tested. And that's why I think during since the outbreak of coronavirus, we are talking about the resilience, how to promote the resilience and sustainable food system. And also we're talking about how to strengthen the local food supply, local food system to ensure that during the situation like emerging infectious disease, that we implementing the lockdown control measures, that everyone stay home. And that's why, as some of the colleagues mentions, several activities and also in terms of the usual business cannot happen. That's why there are several activities is ongoing at the local level, at the country level. For example, in terms of let's say direct deliveries to home, which actually is one of the let's say the activity is ongoing and also changing the food system at the moment. And also we know that several countries are facing of the logistics and also the transportation of the food crossing the borders, and also the delays of the transportations of those food at the borders is also another issue. We know that some food supplies in terms of the volumes or the quantities is enough at the country level, but in terms of the logistics and also the transportations is another issues that several countries are facing at the moment. That's why it's also linked to the price that farmers get lower price, and also but for the consumer side now the price of some food is increasing, and that's why I think we also have to look at those impact and also the lesson learned and also the situation in different countries, in different communities have a different experience. That's why I think it's good that we have an opportunities to share information and also experience among different countries, different stakeholders, and also different agencies, which actually I think are, I also would like to thank the organizers of these events that give us a platform to exchange views among the members and also our different stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that thoughtful intervention and for being party to this very important exchange here. I'm going to hand it over to Ruchi for the next component of the panel.
Thank you, everyone. So what I would suggest is that we have our 5 panelists. Our colleagues from FAO had to leave, but we will get the questions to them and also get their presentation. So if we can just have each of you speaking one after the other, but focusing on the solutions and the kinds of policy responses needed, including addressing any questions that have been raised for you specifically. So you all have 5 minutes, and we will start in the same order. So we will not reintroduce you, but we will start with Mr. Branca, then go to Ms. Yambi, Dr. Ramu, Sophia, and Mamadou in that order. So Mr. Branca, please.
Thank you very much, Ruchi. What are the solutions? Certainly, the first set of solutions have to be on food systems and the continuity on food system. You already heard some of those proposals from Maximo, from several of the people who spoke, but WHO issued guidance for food operators because we need to make sure that the health of food operators is maintained. And these are basic rules like the distancing, the use of masks, the hand hygiene. But clearly, food operators need to continue their activity. The second important aspect is around the distribution systems. And there's been quite a lot of discussion around wet markets. As you know, the coronavirus has a zoonotic origin. So it originates from an animal. We're not clear as yet as to what has been the intermediate host from the bat to the humans. But there is a suspicion that unhealthy food markets might be an issue. There's a strong call now to prohibit and to close wet markets overall. What WHO says is that clearly there is a call to ban the consumption of wildlife, but then that absolute clear rules of how to hold wet markets with the separation of the animal from the vegetables, and a clear exclusion of the killing of animals in the markets. So this is an important change that needs to happen in the food system. Second aspect is around food distribution. We've heard about the importance of procurement system with short chains, absolutely important practices. We know that public food procurements are critical. Food banks as an alternative system, but that means that there must be clearly a capacity by the public sector to operate them, an investment in this by the public sector. At the moment, some of these systems which are still there are overwhelmed. They can't cope with a large demand. There are definitely a lot of very good examples. In Italy, I think the Iranian ambassador mentioned China, but also Italy. In Italy, in Milan, there's an extremely good experience on how to handle a food chain, also linked to the smallholders but what is important is that cities need to develop their own food security plans. Some cities do have those plans, but it's important that all cities have those security plans. Third point is information to the population on what is a healthy and safe diet. We have heard from some part of the world, I think we heard from Southeast Asia, that there are unjustified concern about transmission of coronavirus through foods. That's completely unjustified. There's no transmission of the virus through food. Particularly dairy products are considered a concern. There's no concern at all. Of course, these products have to be handled with the usual precautions to keep food safe. We're actually celebrating on the 7th of June, a World Food Safety Day. We're trying to highlight the importance of healthy food market, but also the fact that food safety is everybody's business, from the producers to the distributors to the consumers. And final point is, of course, policies in health systems. This very much depends on the context in each country, on the nature of and the extent of the epidemic. But WHO, together with UNICEF and other agencies, are developing guidance to ensure that basic services are maintained, and particularly that we are capable of continuing community case management of childhood illnesses with adequate distancing and hygiene, with adequate health workers protection, but those services need to continue. On breastfeeding, we're advocating for continuation of breastfeeding. Mothers and children should remain together, particularly in the first few hours of life. Of course, using respiratory hygiene, cleaning and of the hands continuous, and only in extreme situation, for extreme maternal illness, considering that the separation of the mother of the child, but with ways to maintain breastfeeding through expression of milk, for example. So that has to continue. We need to avoid that services that are already burdened are affecting the vulnerable population. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Branca. That was really comprehensive and useful. Ms. Yambi?
Thank you very much. Maybe a quick response on some of the policy measures that can be taken based on what is happening already. Absolute measures to take immediate action to protect the most vulnerable. A lot of countries have experience with social cash transfers. Of course, the scale of this and the targeting would need to be adjusted to the current realities. It's not just going back to the same targeted population that was subject of cash transfers, but any measures to address, whether through emergency food distribution, cash availability, which would require probably major budgetary reallocation, because we cannot count on the money coming from somewhere else. So there would be need within governments to reprioritize expenditures in light of this crisis. Secondly, I think it would be extremely important at a global level to continue, build upon, accelerate the work around resilient agroecological food systems. We shouldn't lose sight of that, because I think it would do us a lot of service in terms of food being consumed closer to where it is produced. A lot of the socio-economic dimensions, Sophia already mentioned the role of CSAs and rapid action that has been taken, and how could we sustain that going forward. There is a very important need, given what communities are already doing to reorganize themselves, to really look at the whole agenda of how we rebalance economic power for food as a public good, so that we don't revert to the dominance of the big players over the small, seemingly small players who are so fundamental in the provisioning that we are seeing during this crisis. And fourthly, at a global policy level, really very important to safeguard the important global governance of the food system through the CFS, the CSM mechanism, and looking very concisely, how do we rethink the 2021 Food Systems Summit, so that all the elements coming up now in light of this crisis would be embraced, and opening the space for multiple actors whose niches should be clearly spelled out, so that again, it's not the big powers, money controllers that would dominate the agenda. I think that would be a lost opportunity. There are already measures that are being taken within regions and across several countries to address the challenges of logistics, supply, transportation of the food that is seemingly available in the world. So certain regions, like in Southern Africa, development, there is a facilitation of cross-border transport operations in light of COVID-19. And measures like that pursued at a small scale, wherever operational, I think would help us a lot. And I would hope that government working with communities would look into how to ensure minimum prices for the producers, but also measures of price control, because there are opportunists out there who are looking into making profits out of suffering of others. So policy measures around price control and facilitation of incomes, especially for the small producers, would be extremely useful as broad policy actions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was, that was a really comprehensive and inspiring and practical at the same time. Dr. Ramu, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think while there's a lot of distress which has been caused because of COVID, it also has thrown up several opportunities. I think it made world to rethink about how fragile our economic systems and our food systems are. So I think from that point, if you look at it, I think there will be a significant shift towards consumption of safe and healthy food. I think that's going to happen. So based on that, how we reorganize food systems is something we need to look for. One of the key challenge which has thrown up is the very incidence of a disease which can hold the entire world for ransom. So that's the kind of thing. So the risky technologies which are now being pushed onto the communities and people and the countries, saying they will increase your productivities like genetic engineering and all, I think has to be relooked into. I think the biosafety of food systems is the most critical thing, and I think we should really worry about it. Say if one virus could cause such a havoc, and yet dealing and tampering with several lives. So I think it's going to have a serious problem. So tampering with genes and then in the name of productivity increase, I think should be more seriously looked into, and then the biosafety system should be increased. I think that is something which is very important. Similarly, in terms of food marketing systems, depending on long supply chains and the very large corporates coming and then providing food security to the world, I think should be we should get out of that model and then focus more on smallholder agriculture, local markets kind of thing. So public income, when it comes to the government, in terms of public investments to drive particular models of agriculture, they should focus on smallholder, local resource-based, agroecological approaches, I think is what one need to look at. Second, in terms of marketing models, government should invest more on building community institutions, local markets, the farmer producer organizations, and then strengthening them and then linking them to the market. I think that's where public investment should go. Rather than today, large investments are being made on building big food parks and then subsidizing the longer supply chains, export markets kind of. I think that's where the role of government comes in. Similarly, the reverse migration which has happened from urban to rural areas and then which probably will happen all over the world because of the threat posed by this insecure job position may also provide opportunities for rural employment, particularly getting into agriculture and related works. But the building safety nets is something which is very important. So till now, not much is talked about and not much is looked into from the government side in terms of providing safety nets for the unorganized communities, particularly people engaged in food production and processing. So that area is something which is very, very important, and that provides both in terms of opportunities as well as in terms of having safe food. One more important thing which may happen and then which provides opportunities also, can we migrate jobs to rural areas? I think in terms of economy, we should look at that. Several of the opportunities which are being built up in urban areas, say for example, food processing, small food processing units can always move to rural areas. They can also move small manufacturing units to rural areas. So I think a distributed decentralized development, I think, is going to be the opportunity, and I think public investment should go there. So in terms of investments, they should put more on smallholder agriculture, agroecological approaches, community-based organizations, building local markets, that dimension. In terms of regulation, I think particularly on the biosafety issues, much more stringent regulation should come in globally and nationally, and that will improve the food systems is what I would see.
Thank you, Dr. Ramu. And what I could say is Dr. Ramu is also talking from a very practical experience of having tried what he is speaking to. So over to you, Sophia.
Thank you. A few things in response and then a few things from the list of possible things to do. So one is, as the Ambassador reminded us, that the crisis is dynamic, and out of that there are employment opportunities as well as losses, and that's some of what we've seen in China. I think also important that the sectors of the economy affected are all of them, and in some ways other sectors, manufacturing and services, are affected first and more quickly than agriculture, if you think about what's happened to the tourism sector, for example. So just for us to always be thinking about how food systems are part of many sectors in an economy, and not only looking at agriculture in isolation. The question of, I think what Maximo Torero's point is that there's abundant food, and we have lots of information on it. We said this is something that was one of the important outcomes of the last crisis, the creation of the Agricultural Market Information System, IPES. I'm going to try to slow down. So this is stocks of staple foods in the world somewhere. this crisis is affecting our ability to get food to places. And we saw it locally where supermarket shelves were stripped, but we've seen it also at the ports. He was showing us how some of the slowdowns and choke points that emerged. We see it in processing facilities, basically wherever people are gathered to do a job, there's been an effect. And so the problem is how we're moving our food through the system, and then how we might be creating new problems as we go. So I think we're hearing, especially from Africa, that we're potentially creating problems that we don't need to, because we're trying to all respond alike to a crisis, and we need to be actually thinking through what do we need to do in our context where we live in order to both protect our right to food and our right to health. So the access is, I think it's the point that Amartya Sen made most famously. You can starve to death amidst plenty of food if you don't have a way to access that food. And that might mean that you're elderly or disabled and stuck in a house. It might mean that you're a child in a household where there's not enough food. You were relying on a school lunch that now isn't coming. Most for people, it means you've lost your income for whatever reason. And there's huge food waste associated with this particular shock because of people's both cutting off outlets like restaurants and wet markets, and cutting off people's income so their means to buy the food. So that's why there's not a scarcity issue for now. We could create one if we're not careful. I think in terms, there's many things to say about what we should do. I'm going to maybe focus on a few that I think are around stability. How do we protect that fourth pillar of food security? So we have a UN call for a global stimulus package. How do we engage public resources and at every level? This is, for me, a challenge that has to be global as well as national, as well as Francesco mentioned, the city planning, and how is the city going to mobilize resources when it's lost its tax base. The social protection programs, that was a big lesson out of last crisis, and also an important one. There's been a lot of experiment. Who is reached with programs? What kind of programs? How do we make them at this time universal and accessible? And then how do we, with more time, think about how to refine them? We need budgetary support, especially for net food importing countries. That was another lesson from last time. It'll be true this time as well. The sources of foreign exchange for many developing countries have been cut very severely by the fall in oil prices, by the end of tourism, by the cut in foreign remittances from people who are working elsewhere when we're sending money home. Then we need transparency. I'll make this the last point. One of the effects of the crisis has been to shut down or to slow our access to democratic decision-making channels. And how we use this money, how we respond to the crisis, how we make sure we hear from people as they are affected, what they need. With this time, we need more democracy, not less. But we see some countries where parliaments have closed. We see most countries where if they're managing through a virtual system, which is clearly not going to be equally accessible to all. But we also have an opportunity in, for example, this kind of discussion. We don't all have to be in Rome to hear from one another. And I think that that's a powerful lesson for us in terms of democratizing who we hear from. But it'll be very important to keep the channels open. This includes the CSM, of course, the CSF, the Committee on Food Security, and the CSM as part of that. How can we use this platform to be sharing experiences, again, as the ambassador from Iran said, to be learning from what's going on, to not repeat mistakes, and to encourage this last piece from Malek about, will people get more protectionist? Yes, it's a common response, and we have a number of governments who already have behaved in fairly uncooperative ways in the international system. I think that we have other tendencies, other impulses. I understand there's a conversation tomorrow virtually, but hosted at the UN in New York on the potential food crisis with all the Rome agencies and a number of governments. I think we'll also see governments reaching out, and I think we'll, just as in communities, we've seen some people hoard and some people work out how they can help get food to their neighbors, and we just need to be keeping open the mechanisms we have in place to ensure coordination and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, again for your really insightful thoughts. Last but not the least, over to you, Mamadou. Sorry, please unmute.
Hello?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, thanks a lot. A lot has been said, but I will emphasize on some key points in addition to what Olivia just said also concerning Africa. I think there are two sets of solutions that we need really to consider. The first set will be a conjunctural solutions. This is really, there are some emergencies that need to be tackled. And the second set of solution will be structural solutions. That is for the long term. This is what Africa is sometimes very weak at the governance level. So thinking about the future and preventing this kind of pandemic in the future. For the first set, I think that actually, as I mentioned, there is a big problem just for people accessing to food because of the price sometimes, because of the accessibility, availability of the food, because it's not produced in some of the areas where some of the consumers are. So there is really a need at the national level for the first time actually just to invest in solidarity between regions, sub-regions, and between countries to ensure that those who are really affected deeply by this COVID-19 pandemic in terms of accessing to food can access to food. This is the time for many countries to open the food reserves that exist in some of the part of the continent, and in a very equitable way to identify those who need this food to access to it. The second emergency, I think, issue that need to be addressed is preparing for the new rainy season for some countries, but also the storage of food to avoid some of the shortages that we may face very, very soon. This means that there is a need to reinvest resources in preparing the new rainy season coming in, but also the return of some.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Could someone mute?
Okay.
Rodrigo,
so
please.
Also, some pastoralist group coming back home. Some have been stuck in neighboring countries. They don't have access to their own country actually. So to avoid these people to starve because of the difficulty that may face in the border, just allowing them to come back and also preparing their coming back. This means that providing food resources so that they can come back home. This is mainly in East Africa, but also West Africa and part of Central Africa. Emergence issue. And I'm sure that people will be destabilized in some countries in Africa because of the access to seeds. Because this is something that we have been denouncing for a long time, that the seed system that we are trying to promote and the national seed system is not sustainable. This is a typical example. Now, in some countries, people are importing seeds, hybrid seeds from different continents, and now actually that borders are closed, that all the businesses are closed. So access to seed will be very problematic in some of the African countries. So how to prevent it? This means that those who are still in a position to provide should be also working with other countries so that we can sort out this issue of access to some of the factor of production. It's the same thing like mineral fertilizers access will be very problematic. So these are some of the emergencies preparing for the new rainy season and allowing those who are food searchers just to access to food and reorganizing and contributing to the territorial market so that they can provide, and some of them have a possibility just to recreate this solidarity between producers and consumers. But there are some long-term perspectives that you need really to consider. So the first one is we need to change completely our investment in the food system. This means that there is a there are part of this, our food system that is really broken. And it's broken because of the institutional discussion that we have been having in the governance of a food system. So countries need to understand that if your food is in the hands of others, this means that you will be starving one day. So we need to reconsider food, the place, the role of food in the life of a country, of a community, of a continent, and then reconsider what the way that you are providing this food to people and how you are producing and how you are just making it available. This means processing issues where women are concentrated in should be reconsidered and then reinvented, because we need really to invent solutions that are really make progress in other parts of the world, but also in the continent. So reframing our perspective on the food system is, for me, a structural problem. So our economy is also, if you look at the way that Africa is suffering from the debt burdens, there is a need also to reconsider the debt system that we are having. So for me, now actually they're talking about debt moratorium. We don't need this moratorium, because that will just increase the problem for the future, because there will be an increase of the amount to be paid in the very near future when people will come out from this pandemic. And secondly, is creating a kind of mess between different countries. So debt relief means that we need to reconsider how the resources that we are using, this is 1/3 of the revenue of the total trade of Africa, a continent like Africa is going to the debt and its services, need also to be reconsidered and then reinvested in the development of agriculture, fishing, and cattle and pastoralism and all the like, actually. So to avoid this kind of situation that we are having, depending on importation of some of the food crops, that like rice in the case of West Africa, where I don't know many of the countries how they will do, those who are really depending on rice and they are not producing that rice, like Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and other countries. So there is a need also to reframe our food system at that level. And for me, the last one, because we don't have enough time, is all these commitments that have been made for institutional procurement systems for the long term, and allowing also to develop the agroecological perspectives of the production system, but also processing, access to food, and then this kind of the kind of market that we need to promote. There is a need also to invest on that, just to avoid a situation that we are facing actually, where people don't know what to do because simply they don't have these strong linkages between production, harvesting, and the losses that are linked to it, conservation, and access to accessing to this food that is sometimes processed or not. So we need really to work on this perspective for me, and to allow this continent to learn lessons from this and then reinvest in our food system more than the production system and the food system, and then getting also support for smallholders, big majority at rural level, who can reinvest in the local economy and to allow the continent to move out of this extreme poverty that most of the population are facing. So I will just stop here to say that these two levels need to be really separated. We have some conjunctural problems. This is to sort out these actually, in addition to access to the health systems and all this kind of thing, to reinvest also in the second level, that is the structural problems that we are having. And then this is the mode of investing, the mode of production, the mode of consumption that we have to change, and the mode of governance that we have also in this continent related to access to food, but also in a sustainable way. So I will stop here, and hoping that we'll continue the discussions in online and via other means. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much to all the participants. If anything, this wonderful 2 hours, and we're a little over time here, we apologize. It's just a beginning to what is clearly a deep and complex set of issues. And if anything, this has re-emphasized just how fragile and vulnerable some of our food systems and health systems are, and the vital need to have this kind of a platform, the CFS platform, where policy convergence and the different voices from different areas, different expertise gets shared, and we collaborate in a sensible, humane way to make things better. So thank you very much. A very special thank you to our panelists. And I know that you're taking valuable time out of busy days, so we've really appreciated your interventions and your contributions. This has been recorded, so those who want to review parts of it or hear it again will have a chance to do so. A special thanks, as I said, to our panelists. We have the Torero document online on the CSM website. We want to thank Francesco Branca. All of us are very reliant now on the World Health Organization, and that linkage between health and food has never been more obvious than it is now. To Olivia Yambi, to Dr. Ramanjaneyulu, sorry, pronunciation, and Sophia and Mamadou, thank you all very much. And we close this session, but we don't close our international conversations around what needs to be done and how we go forward in a more humane and collaborative way, which the CFS platform affords us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and goodbye all.
Thank you, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.